What I'd like for us to talk about next is defense mechanisms. When we're experiencing a state of anxiety, we tend to engage in these defense mechanisms as a way to kind of work our way through what's going on. Defense mechanisms are basically a coping mechanism. The id and superego, by nature, they are in opposition of each other. So the ego is having to figure out how to satiate the two. And this process, even if it's on an unconscious level, can result in anxiety and stress. When we're looking at this anxiety, we can engage unconsciously in these defense mechanisms as a way of coping with the stress or conflict that's happening within or outside of our awareness. When we're looking at repression, this is when we block things that are unacceptable or difficult for us to deal with. It could be things that threaten our sense of self, wishes or experiences that we have been taught aren't okay. A lot of times I have learned from people who identify with the LGBTQ plus community that initially they had to repress their feelings. Why did they have to repress those feelings? Because they were taught growing up that how they identify and how they feel is wrong or immoral. So there's that repression that takes place to try to hide it, even from themselves. But we are who we are, and so at some point that will take a toll. Another form of repression is maybe how we're affected emotionally by something. If you've ever experienced a death of someone close to you, or even your pet, the devastation and the pain associated with that loss, and the loss, by the way, can also be a breakup in a relationship, that pain associated with the loss can be overwhelming. And so one way that we deal with it sometimes is just repressing. And so one way we can deal with it is by repressing how we feel, even though we might not even realize we're doing that. I remember when my mother passed away years ago, I was so stressed, depressed, so much so that without doing anything, I lost 40 pounds. I didn't even eat. I had to remind myself to eat. This is a big deal for me. I love food. So for me not to eat, it's a huge deal. I'm not feeling well psychologically, emotionally, or physically. Something's going wrong if I'm not eating regularly. So when we're looking at this repression, it could be so intense. We don't even realize that we're holding in something that's affecting us. Another thing that we can think of related to repression would be if someone's had a traumatic experience, they will repress the memory of that experience. And then maybe later on they're under hypnosis or someone shares a similar story to what they went through, or they're in therapy and it gets brought to the surface. But they initially repress that memory. Why do you think we engage in this repression automatically, unconsciously? Well, think about this. If we had to deal with those feelings of devastation or sadness every day, multiple times a day maybe, that would be really, really rough. So what our brain does for us is it will actually repress that memory so that our functioning can be done a little bit easier. We can make our way through our day-to-day duties and responsibilities and make our way through whatever it is that we got to get through and complete whatever it is that we have to complete. So that repression serves a function in that moment. Regression. This is where we revert to an earlier stage of our life, engage in behaviors related to that stage. So if you know of a little kiddo who's going to school for the very first time, they might start to suck their thumb, or maybe they wet their bed the night before because they're so stressed about going to school for the first time. These are behaviors they stopped engaging in early on, but all of a sudden these behaviors are coming up. I remember a student in one of my classes shared that her son was the first grandchild for a long time until her sister had a baby 3 years later. And the first time her nephew was coming over to visit with them, her son started reverting back to his baby behaviors because he was threatened by the fact that now this new baby might replace him, which obviously is not the case. But he was so stressed and threatened by the incoming new baby that he started reverting to his own baby-like behaviors. We might find ourselves in stressful situations where we start to lash out or tantrum or whine. And these are all things that we engage in, defense mechanisms, because we're trying to cope with what we're dealing with in the moment. So regression, reverting back to behaviors that we used to engage in especially in childhood or an earlier stage of development when we're dealing with anxiety. Reaction formation. This is when we substitute behaviors, thoughts, or feelings that are seen as unacceptable, especially by others in society. Those things are seen as taboo. So instead of engaging in those things that we're wanting to, we do the direct opposite. Say, for instance, someone wants to use drugs. So the direct opposite would be to not. Another example is if someone wants to exercise sexual freedom, but society might still be old school, especially if they're female, and so they don't. So whatever it is that society is deeming as not okay, instead of engaging in that behavior or thoughts, the person will do the direct opposite of it. Projection is when we put onto others unacceptable feelings, traits, or thoughts about ourselves that we don't want to have about ourselves. Say, for instance, I'm frustrated with myself because I forgot to take an exam and I interact with somebody else and I'm like, oh my God, they're so stupid. When really, I'm the one who's stupid because I forgot to take my test. That's how I'm feeling about myself. But I don't want to feel like that about myself. So I just put it on somebody else. Maybe I don't want to see myself as rude. So whatever feeling I have about myself, I don't want to have those feelings, so I put it on someone else. This is projection. Rationalization. This is when I come up with other explanations to cover up what's actually going on. So why did I fail that exam? It's not because I didn't prepare. It's not because I didn't get a good amount of sleep. It's not because I decided to get distracted with other things that are more fun versus studying for it and preparing for it. No, it's because the exam was unreasonable or the professor was unreasonable. They didn't cover this material. So instead of owning up to why that happened, that I contributed to, what happens is I come up with excuses. And it's all so that I can maintain a positive sense of self. Denial. This is when there's evidence before me and I refuse to accept it. This often is involved when we're looking at someone who is addicted to a drug. I can tell them that there's so many things that show that they've developed an addiction, but they will completely deny that that's the case. If someone's having a difficult time and someone close to them says, I see all these things happening, they still will deny it and say they're fine. I've heard students say, oh, my friends tried to tell me that my partner was cheating on me, showed me all this evidence, and I still denied it in the moment because I couldn't believe it. This denial takes place so that we don't have to deal with something that's very difficult for us. Dealing with it would be really hard and maybe even painful. So this is not denial where someone's not telling you intentionally the full truth. This is where they don't even see it. Even when you present evidence in front of them and you think it's so obvious, but they don't see it and they might not see it because it's just too hard. Displacement. This is where we have feelings about someone of authority, but we're unable to take it out on them. So what we do is we take it out on other people who are not threatening or less threatening. So students have oftentimes shared in class where they have a parent coming home from work. Their boss was really awful to them that day, and they come home and they lash out at everybody at home, including them. Why wouldn't the parent go back to their boss? Because they might need their job. No different than, say, you wanted to lash out at a professor. You probably would be intimidated to do so because of the implications that that could have if you're still in class with them. An example from my childhood is I remember being mad at my mom one time, and she told me to go to my room. On my way to my room, I slammed my door shut. I really wanted to yell back at her. I didn't, but I slammed that door. And let me tell you, there were consequences for that. Displacement, again, is where we have feelings about someone of authority. We can't take it out on them, so we take it out on someone less threatening, even an object. Sublimation. This is when we might have undesirable, unacceptable, or taboo feelings and thoughts and desires, undesirable or unacceptable per society or our families. Instead of putting our energies into those taboo things, what we do is we put our energies into something that's socially acceptable, things that our families would more easily accept. Here are some examples students have come up with. A person has visions of wanting to cut people, so they become a surgeon. A story that was told to me once was a person who was having sexual frustration with their partner, and this person didn't want to cheat on their partner, so they would spend hours working out through martial arts. And that was daily. So whatever it is that that person wants to engage in that they've been taught is not okay, what they do is they find a different way to invest that energy in a behavior that is acceptable by others. What I'd like for you to keep in mind are a couple pairings that sometimes students get confused. The first one is projection and displacement. Remember, projection is feelings I have about myself, while displacement is feelings I have about someone of authority. So make sure you're clear on the distinction between those two. Another pairing that sometimes students get confused is reaction formation and sublimation. Reaction formation is, instead of doing the taboo thing, I do the direct opposite, while sublimation says, instead of doing that taboo thing, I do what's socially acceptable. Make sure you're clear on the difference between those two as well.